The foundation of both Unitarianism and Universalism, which are the two faith traditions from which Unitarian Universalism comes, were founded on the Enlightenment principles, those of reason and skepticism and democracy, individual liberty, freedom of expression, eradication of religious authority. And if all of that sounds pretty familiar, it's because in many ways this is still foundational to our understanding of religion, still foundational to our nation's understanding of itself. However, modern Unitarianism, Universalism, and that's as opposed to much earlier movements that embraced one or both of those doctrines. Modern Unitarian and Universalism, what we understand them to be, both began in the late 1700s, early 1800s. They came to be known for particular doctrines. Unitarianism for its belief in a singular God, as opposed to Trinitarianism. Unitarianism meant that Jesus was not divine, or at least not in the same way that God was. And then Universalism, which believed in universal salvation, the notion that all people would be saved regardless of their religious ideas, regardless of their own goodness or lack thereof. Both of these traditions, in addition to those particular beliefs, actually embraced a rather wide set of liberalish ideas. A lot of those ideas were the same or similar to those Enlightenment ideas I shared a few moments ago. Things like individual liberty, including the freedom to believe what you wished. A support for democracy, including in our own institutions, like in this congregation where we vote on all the important matters together. Freedom of expression. I feel very few limits on what I can say up here. There are some things I probably shouldn't say if I want to, keep a job or not alienate the entire congregation, but I have a broad array of things I can say. And we could name more of these values that are important to us. In fact, it was through those lenses of Enlightenment philosophy that our forebears came to those religious positions. Unitarians famously read their Bibles very closely, and they read them in such a way that they noticed that there wasn't a lot of things in there that they had been taught to believe, in fact. Nowhere in the Bible does the word Trinity appear, for instance. The divinity of Jesus is not clear if you read the scriptural witness. It's ambiguous. They argued that there wasn't a need for baptism. They pointed out that hell isn't mentioned in the Bible, to name a few of these. The Universalists used reason similarly, but applied to a different religious problem. They said if God is powerful and loving, and they believed both of those things to be true, how could God condemn anyone to an eternity of punishment? They said God wouldn't. So today we still embrace many of these Enlightenment values, as I said a minute ago. Certainly we like individual liberty, freedom of expression, democracy. I think it's fair to say we're pretty ingrained in skepticism. We're perhaps not for the eradication of religious liberty, but religious authority, rather. But we certainly like questioning it a lot. But we've also, over these last couple centuries, learned a lot more about the limits of reason, the limits of deductive logic as a means of evaluating our world. Postmodernism has made us question how we regard truth, how our contexts and our lenses affect what we might think of as obvious or immutable. Science itself has thrown into question what we even can know. Uncertainty and chaos seem to be fundamental aspects of our universe. And so, today's topic I titled, Be Reasonable. Perhaps you've heard this phrase. Perhaps you have been told it at one or more points in your life. Perhaps you have said it to others at one or more points in your life. Be reasonable, which is supposed to be stop being unreasonable, usually. But in my experience, often means just shut up and agree with me already. We are, as a faith tradition, deeply tied to the use of reason. The Unitarian Universalist long-standing sources specifically cited guidance of reason and the results of science as part of what we draw upon. Similarly, our principles, they don't use the word reason, but they certainly follow in this vein as well. Those of you who are really plugged into the Unitarian Universalist Association know that we just changed and updated all of that language. They're now called inspirations and values rather than sources and principles. And there's no longer the specific word reason in them, but it's still hugely important to our faith. In fact, the new wording was changed in part because of what I'm talking about today, both that we value reason, but we also know that there are challenges to it and limits to it. We live in a postmodern age, and our UUA bylaws language finally reflects that, but that's a whole another set of sermons to get into postmodernity. Instead, we are people who strive, I think, to be reasonable, to be reality-based, problem-solving types. We think, and you can agree or disagree with me, but I think I'm right about this, we think that most of the world's problems are caused by ignorance, and that better understanding would solve most or all of those problems. I'm a little more skeptical about that, frankly. The science and reasoning of climate change has been clear for some time now. There's no reasonable view of the situation that could doubt that humans are causing climate change, or that the general things we need to do to slow and reverse it, that is, drastically reduce our use of fossil fuels, for instance, that's clear. And yet it will not come as news to any of you that the reasonable, logical thing to do in this situation is not, by and large, what we are doing. Not as a planet. There are some logical reasons for this, namely that there are a lot of short-term incentives for many people to do things that result in long-term harm to our planets. And so this is one place where reasonable arguments often fail. It's when we're having two different discussions. So in this case, one or both sides will not be reasonable in any sense of that phrase, because they are being reasonable in their own framework. Moreover, you can't have a reasonable conversation with someone who doesn't want to be reasonable. Those of you who have ever had a conversation with a toddler are familiar with this dynamic. And this is where Enlightenment principles too often fail. We think, and I very much include myself in this, that if we could just craft the exact right arguments, if we could present the right piece of evidence, we will suddenly win our opponents over with the brilliance, the simple, obvious rightness of our position. So let's instead talk about how we deal with those who are not interested in being reasonable in several ways. One is to be firm, but not fixed in your own convictions. That is, hold tightly to what you believe to be right, but also be willing to entertain the notion that you might be wrong, at least about some things. This is not an easy thing to do, but one that I hope in this congregation we can often practice. I have been wrong many times. It is never a pleasant experience to realize that, as I talked about in a sermon a few weeks ago, but it's important. That's where actual growth happens. A second thing to know is that we can learn to recognize when someone is not interested in a real exchange of ideas. Sometimes this is easy. If you're dealing with people screaming political slogans at you, they are not looking for a reasoned discussion. There is a saying called, "Don't bring a persuasive essay to a protest." It doesn't work. Another hint is if you are in an online discussion in the comments, you have already lost. But there's an increasing level of sophistication about this. You sometimes hear people you hear this on talk shows a lot, rather. Talk shows can sound like two people are on opposite sides of an issue and are really engaging seriously because they seem reasonable and are talking to one another, sort of. But if you listen closely, they're not interested in anything that doesn't support their points. They'll repeat their point rather than ever seriously engaging yours. And I think as Unitarian Universalists, we too often engage these people in good faith, despite the fact that they've shown no good faith at all. And 3, and this is an extension of 2 in many ways, pick what arguments you want to have and with whom. Now, in theory, we all know this, right? The popular form of this phrase is pick your battles. Politics is the art of the possible, to use a very DC phrase. Though I learned in preparing for this sermon that phrase is not by some DC politician. It was originally coined by Otto von Bismarck, of all people. If I can butcher some German quick, I'll tell you it. It's Die Politik ist die Lehre vom Möglichen. There you go. He said it first. Now, when I say these things, someone will inevitably ask me, but shouldn't we engage in good faith? Shouldn't we be better than them? Shouldn't we go high when they go low? Shouldn't we show them the right way to do things? And how can you say pick your arguments when the most important is sometimes the most difficult? I say that those are all nice sentiments. I agree with them, and none of them work against fascists. In these times, I often think of some words from Martin Luther King Jr. You may have heard this, but they're not the sort of thing that people quote on MLK Day because they make a lot of people uncomfortable. He said, "The question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice?" I love this quote because it is not the warm, fuzzy Martin Luther King that we hear a lot about every year. He was serious about what he was doing. He was not interested in compromising on basic human rights. Being an extremist for love and justice means being unwilling to compromise on the full humanity of people. For me, it means, for instance, not thinking that a 10-week or a 20-week ban on abortion somehow makes sense. The thing that makes sense is to trust pregnant people and their medical professionals to make the right decision themselves. Being an extremist for justice means not letting individual states decide whether or not their citizens are entitled to fundamental rights. And you might recall we fought an entire war about this. Being an extremist for love and justice means examining your own privilege and then using it to dismantle systemic racism. It means, to give a small example, doing the sort of work that led to updating our values so that they more accurately reflect who we as Unitarian Universalists are in 2024 as opposed to 1985. It sometimes also means fighting the most difficult fight, even if it's unwinnable right now. I think of activists from the past and the often thankless work they did. Think of the arguments we're having today that weren't possible a generation or 2 or 5 ago. And my fear is that in this current climate, we're about to have the same fights. We already are having the same fights that many of us thought were won. Things like abortion, the right to contraceptives, same-sex marriage, and others. So in addition to our historic and current commitment to reason and other Enlightenment values, which I really do think are important, I want to offer some thoughts about what we need to do now as Unitarian Universalists. A lot of this comes from a report called Widening the Circle of Concern, written several years ago. It attempts to address how the Unitarian Universalist Association and how each of us can make anti-racist commitments, can further our anti-racist commitments, rather, and support becoming a truly inclusive community committed to justice. Towards the end of the chapter in that report called Theology, there are several takeaways, and I'll share most of them. So here they are. Our faith traditions as Unitarian Universalists require us to address equity, inclusion, and diversity issues. I'll just note myself that DEI has become a buzzword of attack, right? Faith and covenant are not dirty words. If freedom and individualism are our most important values, we have little to offer in these times. These times require a liberatory faith that invites each of us into the spiritual work of empathy and healing. Justice-making is not a substitute for coherent theology, and faithful justice-making requires a liberatory theology. An articulation of what is commonly believed among us need not result in a creedal test for membership. Too many Unitarian Universalists do not know what saving and liberatory truths can be found right within their own faith tradition. There are more, and I recommend reading it. I can share it with you if you would like to know more about that. But I think that all of these sentiments, that we need coherent theology, that we need to explore deeper in our own spiritual lives, that's the foundation for how we do justice-making in the world, is important and true and something that is necessary for us to progress and for us to fight rising fascism. So may these sentiments help guide us into a new future, one where reason will guide us, but also our communities, our hearts, and our dreams will lead us forward. May it be so.